So PowerPivot 64-bit can handle hundreds of millions of records, right? There used to be a 2 gigabyte limit on the 64-bit version that was in Excel 2010. Now with Excel 2013, that limit is no longer there. There's still a limit on the SharePoint side. If you wanted to upload a PowerPivot workbook to SharePoint, you're still going to be limited with that 2 gigabyte. That's configurable as well, but it's, to load anything bigger than 2 gigabytes up to SharePoint is going to take you a long time. But again, they're trying to make it bigger so self-service BI can handle more and more, right? So, but that, it can handle hundreds of millions of records pretty easily. But usually the threshold is memory on your desktop or laptop, like I spoke about before. Most people only have 4 to 16 gigabytes of memory on their desktop or laptop. A particular client that I was into, they only had 4 gigabytes of memory on their laptops. They capped out around close to 200 or 300 million records in some sheets, and that was about it. Everything started to freeze, screens started to flicker. They basically were running out of memory and paging on their machines. So, but SSAS Tabular, on the other hand, it runs on server hardware, right? And you can put about 512 gigabytes of memory on a server these days. If you call up Dell or any other vendor, and I'm not plugging Dell, but just to give an example of this particular client, used Dell servers, and they got a 512 gigabyte machine for a little over $11,000. So it's not something that's huge, right? So why am I concentrated on memory? So PowerPivot and SSAS Tabular, they run on, or they have embedded with them the engine. It's called the X Velocity engine. It used to be known, the artist formerly known as Vertipaq. And it's a compressed memory. It's a compressed database, and it gets loaded into memory, and it's columnar and it's very, very fast, but it's heavily dependent on memory. Especially in SSAS Tabular, once you start getting into bigger corporate solutions, more memory is key. And then on the corporate side, you can basically create partitions for incremental loading, perspectives, security roles. You really can't do that on the self-service side in PowerPivot, right? You're kind of limited to the security that's in Excel. And you can't really do incremental loading. It's really an all-or-nothing approach, and you don't have the flexibility of doing partitions or perspectives or any kind of security roles. So there's just a little bit of difference. Once it gets more mature, the options are there, right? So these two technologies are what I like to call similar different, right? Similarly different. What does that mean? So they're almost identical. If you look at both of them, they both use DAX. If I open them both up on the screen, which I'll do as part of the demo, one's green and one's blue, but they're pretty much the same. Calculated columns, measures, and things like that, they are compatible from PowerPivot to SSAS Tabular. You can copy and paste from one self-service BI and drop it into another, which is corporate BI. And there's not a huge gap between Excel and OLAP any longer, right? So traditionally there was MDX, which was analysis services, or the OLAP solution for Microsoft prior to 2012. To use MDX, it's more advanced. It's not easy at all. And a lot of people that I know shied away from using analysis services just because of the learning curve of MDX. It was a little bit difficult for them to do. Now, Excel is really something that that people get really creative with, macros and VBA and all kinds of things. But Excel language like VLOOKUPs and things like that, if you've ever looked at DAX or used it, it's pretty similar to Excel. And now you can take those Excel skills that you have and basically enhance them by learning DAX. And DAX is the language of both PowerPivot and SSAS Tabular. So once you know one, you can know the other. So really what happened is with these two technologies is really Excel became more advanced and OLAP's entry point became less advanced, right? So they came closer together, right? And so that balance is a lot easier to attain in an organization without that huge gap in knowing how to operate these tools. So you can use both of them. And if you're into a corporate BI solution and you think that you need SSAS Tabular just because you have a lot of data and you say, I know that my data is not going to be able to fit into memory inside of PowerPivot because of the size or whatever, you can prototype with PowerPivot, and this is what I did to make it a success in some of the clients that I work with. I've actually prototyped with the business users who are Excel savvy in a sample PowerPivot workbook. I did simple calculations and measures, KPIs as examples, and I gave it to them. And I basically trained them. And I educated them on how to use PowerPivot to their advantage. And I iteratively educated them on DAX, right? Especially calculate, which I'll show you is the most important function inside of DAX. And once you understand calculate and how it works, it's very, very powerful. And here's the best part of this whole thing. If you build a solution or prototype with a business user inside of PowerPivot, and better yet, they learn how to write the calculations with your guidance, you can take exactly what they've done and you can import it into PowerPivot. I mean, you can import it into SSAS Tabular. So just to recap, you can take a PowerPivot model that a business user has created within Excel, you can save it, you can actually import that model right into SSAS Tabular. Pretty cool stuff. You could never do that before prior to these technologies within Microsoft. And it's one of those things that, you know, if you've got some really great things in PowerPivot, it's sort of like you can upgrade it into SSAS Tabular to get, you know, more performance and better performance. So it's pretty cool. So why should you use both? So, and why should you take that approach? Why should you take that balanced approach of doing it? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about success factors in every BI project. User adoption. That's huge. So I don't know how many of you have ever been part of a BI project where they roll out this fancy corporate BI solution and the users have no idea how to use it. They don't know how it was created. They know they sat down and did a formal requirements process about a year ago, and then they're not really sure about it, right? So user adoption is huge. If users had a hand in creating something, user adoption is going to be a success. It really is. And then training, right? After each BI solution is built, you know, by IT, you're going to require to training the business users on how to do it, right? So if they had a hand in creating it, they're going to get the training from the very beginning. So that's why these two technologies are, it's pretty special that they can be sort of forward engineered, if you will. And your time to market, right? So the requirements process, usually traditionally, if I had to go back to that situation where when we walked in and did a project, we started talking to them, and the formal requirements process basically wasn't that formal at all. It involved the business users, and it wasn't disconnected, and it was small, and their time to market to get them a solution was so much faster because they essentially helped build it in PowerPivot, and we rolled it into SSAS Tabular.